When we talk about salvation, what do we mean? Join me as we gain a new perspective on salvation. Welcome to our final installment in a new perspective on salvation. In this study, we've seen a new perspective on the temptation. We've seen that temptation is much more subtle, at least than I had originally thought. Temptation indeed takes actually good things, but it twists them and turns them into coveting and ultimately addiction. We saw a new perspective on the fall of man, where both in Genesis 3 and Genesis 12, mankind fell. Man fell individually, and it affected everything about him. It affected his sense of morality, his sense of security, and his sense of honor. We saw in Genesis 12 that civilization fell. In the Tower of Babel, civilization came together and jointly decided to resist God. Then in Genesis chapter 6, we saw the fall of celestial beings. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that today to see a little bit more of what was going on there. In a new perspective on the curse, we saw how the curse affects everything that we are. But then we saw God's solution. We see that God gives us an external solution in Jesus on the cross. Jesus on the cross restores innocence to man. He restores security to man, and he restores honor to man by taking on himself all that's bad within us, the guilt of sin, the weakness, and the shame of what we've done. And he gives us back his innocence, his righteousness. He gives us back his status, the honor of being part of God's family. And he gives us back his power through the Holy Spirit. Then we saw an internal solution. The essence of sin is selfishness, self-centeredness in the internal solution. God turns that on his head. He calls us to be Christians, and he calls us to reach out to others, to be others-focused instead of inward-focused. And today in this final installment, we see the corporate solution. Now, we have mentioned the concept of the divine council. We see this in passages like Deuteronomy 32 and 8 and 9. When the Most High assigned lands to the nations, when he divided up the human race, he established boundaries of the people according to the number in his heavenly court. The people of Israel, however, belong to the Lord, and Jacob is his special possession. This and places like Psalm 82 that directly speak of the divine council of the assembly of the sons of God lead many scholars to believe that what biblical authors are presenting is the idea that God has divided up the nations among celestial beings. He asks celestial beings to guide each one of those nations to follow him. But instead of doing that, they each taught those nations to worship they themselves. And so each nation has a different God. We see that referred to in passages like Ezekiel chapter 28, where the Lord, in talking about the king of Tyre, Ezekiel 28, verse 12, "You are the model of perfection, full of wisdom, exquisite in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God." He goes on to talk about how this king of Tyre was beautiful in verse 14. I ordained you and anointed you as the mighty angelic guardian. You had access to the holy mountain of God. You walked among the stones of fire. But then in verse 17, your heart was filled with pride because of all your beauty. So I threw you to the ground and exposed you to the curious gaze of kings. Now, obviously, this isn't talking about the king of Tyre. While it's directed at the king of Tyre, what the Lord is talking about is Satan himself. This is echoed in Isaiah 14, starting in verse 12. How you are fallen from heaven, O shining star, son of the morning, literally Lucifer. You've been thrown down to the earth, you who destroyed the nations of the world. For you said to yourself, I will ascend to heavens and set my throne above God's stars. Again in verse 14, I will climb to the highest heavens and be like the Most High. Satan's sin, the sins of all of these members of the divine council who were placed to take care of the nations of the world. Their sin is the sin of pride, the sin of trying to become like God. The actual sin of Adam and Eve. Satan, when he tempted Adam and Eve, said, you will become like God. Some believe that the story of the fall of man in Genesis 3 is at the same time the fall of Satan, when he usurped God's place. He had been asked to simply be a guardian over Adam and Eve, but instead he took God's place, made himself out to be God, and he too, just like Adam and Eve, fell. No matter what you believe about the nature of Genesis 6, Christendom is in agreement that Satan fell from heaven. He had been one of the prominent angels, but he tried to take God's place and disobeyed God, became who he is today. Now, in 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 18 to 22, there Peter, in talking about the resurrection of Christ, says this, 1 Peter 3, 18 to 22. Christ suffered for our sins once for all time. He never sinned, but he died for sinners to bring you safely home to God. He suffered physical death, but he was raised to life in the Spirit. And so he went and he preached to the spirits in prison, those who disobeyed God long ago when God waited patiently while Noah was building his boat. Only 8 people were saved from drowning in that terrible flood. He goes on, but the point is made. Christ, when he died, went to preach to the spirits who are enchained in prison. That is Christ going to hell to announce to these gods, members of the divine council who had fallen, that he has won the war. Now, we come back to Matthew chapter 16, and all of this has been a precursor to what happens in Matthew chapter 16. Jesus has just asked the disciples, who do you say that I am? Peter answers for the disciples, saying, we believe that you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Starting in verse 17, Jesus replied, you're blessed, Simon, son of John, because my Father in heaven has revealed this to you. You didn't learn this from any human being. You learned it from God. Now I say to you that you are Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the powers of hell, literally the gates of hell, will not conquer it. literally, the gates of hell will not be able to resist it. The question is, what is the rock that Jesus is talking about? There are three possible interpretations. One is that the rock is Peter himself. He makes a point of saying Peter's name means the rock. Upon this rock I'll build my church. Yeah, in context, that sounds reasonable. Peter afterwards does become a key leader in the church. But I kind of think there may be more here. Protestant scholarship has said, no, it's not Peter the man. It is the rock of Peter's declaration. You're the Christ, the Son of the living God. Again, there's quite a bit to be said for that. That is certainly foundational to what we believe. But why talk to that about a rock as a rock? There is a third possibility. Jesus makes this statement, and Matthew is very clear in identifying the region. In chapter 16, verse 13, Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi was a city that had been built by Philip the Tetrarch. He built that city on Mount Hermon, and so the place is identified. Jesus is standing on Mount Hermon. Now, if you remember, when we looked at Genesis chapter 6, we saw how intertestamental literature says that the fall of the angels took place on Mount Hermon. They said that because that was the region of the giants who were the progeny, the descendants of what happened between the sons of God and the daughters of men. Giants were born. Those giants lived in this region called Bashan. The king Og, king of Bashan, the last of the giants, according to the Old Testament, reigned from Mount Hermon. Mount Hermon in Jewish lore had become the center of all that is evil, the center of the giants, the center of false worship. There were two springs that came out of Mount Hermon. They were actually the headwaters of the Sea of Galilee, which became the Jordan River. Those two springs that flowed from underground rivers were called the gates of hell. That is where man, if he could enter the ground at that point, he would be in the kingdom of Satan. Jesus says, on this rock, I'll build my church. What if he was just talking about Mount Hermon, saying, this is the center of what the Jews believe is the kingdom of Satan. On this rock, I'll build my church. At the center of Satan's kingdom, I will build my church. Throughout history, that is exactly where the church has been built. Wherever there is evil, the church is raised. The church doesn't go where things are good. The church goes where things are horrible. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer returns to Nazi Germany because the church goes where evil is at its worst. He paid with his life. Mother Teresa goes to live among the prostitutes of the streets of Calcutta because the church is built where evil is greatest. And so today, our call as the church is to stand against Satan's kingdom, to be wherever evil is and change it, transform it, fight against it, And Jesus' promise is that the gates of hell will not be able to resist the power of his church. 2 Corinthians chapter 10 tells us in verses 3 to 5, we're human, but we don't wage war as humans do. We use God's mighty weapons, not worldly weapons, to knock down the strongholds of human reasoning and to destroy false arguments. We destroy every proud obstacle that keeps people from knowing God. We capture their rebellious thoughts and teach them to obey Christ. Paul says the church goes where the evil is greatest. It might be physical evil. It might be, as he says here, heresy. Well, we capture their rebellious thoughts and we teach them to obey Christ. Today, the church goes where the evil is greatest. The New Testament is full of warfare metaphors, of soldier metaphors. Ephesians chapter 6 tells us that we're to put on God's armor as soldiers. We're to be dressed in the belt of truth. Do you know where that comes from? That comes from Isaiah chapter 11, verse 5. A messianic prophecy that says that the Messiah will be girded with the belt of truth. We're to put on the breastplate of righteousness and the helmet of salvation. That image comes from Isaiah 59:17, another messianic prophecy in which the Messiah wears the breastplate of righteousness and the helmet of salvation. We are to put the sandals of the gospel on our feet. That comes from Isaiah 52, verse 7. Yet another messianic prophecy that says how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news, what the Messiah will do. 4 out of the 6 elements refer back to the book of Isaiah, each one to messianic prophecies. The other 2 items that he mentions, the sword of the Spirit and the shield of faith, don't have Old Testament counterparts, but they're part of what Roman soldiers would have worn and carried. The image is clear here. If we want to put on the armor of God, all we need to do is put on Jesus. We put on Jesus and go to war. The new perspective on the corporate solution is that together the church confronts evil wherever it finds it. Evil cannot resist the power of the cross. Evil cannot resist the church. Let's go out and be the church.